Thank you for joining us for the fourth webinar of the season. TA's Fall 2022 webinar series is being sponsored by Kendall Hunt Publishing Company. Today's webinar, Textbook Authoring Inspirations, Insights, and Innovations, will be presented by one of our members, Jamie Pope. Jamie is the co-author of Nutrition for a Changing World, published by Macmillan Learning and Scientific American. Now in its second edition, it was the recipient of the 2020 Textbook Excellence Award from the Textbook and Academic Authors Association, US. In 2020, she developed and produced an audio course, Nutrition 101, Understanding the Science and Practice of Eating Well, featured on platforms like Apple Books and Audible. She's also an adjunct assistant professor in the Vanderbilt University School of Nursing, a registered dietitian nutritionist, fellow of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, sorry, I'm stumbling over that word, and academic author. Hello, Jamie. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Kim, and greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining in. Kim tells me that we have some of the participants today that are not members of TAA, so you're going to be seeing a few of those resources that are so helpful. But I was telling Kim, this is a little interesting for me to do because I usually am lecturing on nutrition-based topics and doing those. So it's going to be fun for me to share some of my path in terms of publishing, both in popular lay press and trade, and then also academic publishing through writing textbooks and journal articles and such. So we're going to jump in. And let me change my slide here. So we're going to cover a variety of topics today and just touch on these in different ways. A little bit about how writing for academic press is different than trade. We're going to look at what do you think about when you're considering writing a textbook, what background and experience you might need to get the attention of a publisher, how to decide whether to write an introductory or a more advanced level and upper level textbook, a little bit about contracts. But I will be giving you some good resources there, but also speaking from my perspective and experience, which is going to be really the foundation for a lot of today. And then, whether you want to do this by yourself or bring on a co-author, and also how to be different in the market and work with your marketing team in promoting and in sales. So if you're thinking of writing a textbook, there's some questions you need to ask yourself. And these come in part from, I started writing, I got a position at Vanderbilt University in the mid-1980s. And the chair of the department and also my boss at the time, who was a health psychologist, was also publishing in the trade world. He was writing what we called diet books. And I was able to kind of consult with him initially, writing different components of his books, doing some of the research, compiling indexes and appendices and glossaries for him. And at one point, I went in with him on some books. And in so doing, I got to kind of ride on his coattails, so to speak, in terms of working with an agent. So, Kim, can I ask you, my video went away. Are you still seeing it?
Yes, I am still seeing it.
Okay, I'm just not seeing that, but that's fine. And so in working with a literary agent, and this was out of New York, Pine and Associates, I had a few book ideas myself in the 80s and 90s. And I am writing down these questions from memory because I remember having a conversation with him and him telling me about what to include in a proposal. And the main thing is, what is this book? What is it? What's its focus? Who are you to write this book? And, what are your qualifications, your experience? Who are you in that type of field? How's it different from other books on the market? Why would somebody even purchase it or adopt it over your competitors? Who's your target audience? How will it be marketed and sold? So just to give you a few examples on this. And I'm going to speak more to trade right now. So I had a book idea along with a colleague of mine who was a humorist and was published with some cartoon type books. And I had written and co-authored some things in the diet world. and the nutrition arena. And we came up with a book, and this is in the 80s and 90s. This wouldn't go over now. And our title at that time was 50 Ways to Lose Your Blubber. And it was going to be 50 weight management tips based in evidence with, on the other page, a cartoon, kind of a funny illustrating. And it was going to be more of a lighten up, kind of humorous to take, but also providing foundation. Publishers loved it. And when we wrote up the proposal, you know, who were we to write it? How was it different? It certainly was different than other things out there. It looked, 25 publishers looked at it. Nobody ended up going with it, even though some editors called me to talk about it, because in part there was no place for this book. It didn't fit in how-tos. It didn't fit in really humor, and you couldn't give it as a gift to somebody. So even though they liked the concept, we never got it picked up, and we kind of revisited it, but never put it on. And, you know, who was our target audience? With my textbook, certainly it's a little different. What's the book? It was an intro level nutrition textbook. There were already quite a few on the market. And so some were, you know, selling very well and dominating the market in intro nutrition. So why did we need another one? So what is this book? And part of it was that we took a different approach. It was initially intended mainly for students not majoring in nutrition, but we're taking nutrition out of interest or as a prerequisite in another area. So it wasn't going to be quite as heavy hitting, so to speak, as some of the other intro books on the market. It was targeted differently and truly aimed towards student engagement. Who was I to write it? I was a registered dietitian. I had publishing experience. I was a professor at a university, had some writing under my belt. How's it different? We used a story-based approach. We used more visuals and infographics. We set it up in such a way to really maximize student engagement. So that was kind of how we were different. Why would it be purchased or adopted over competitors? That's a big one. In the textbook world, for those of you that are textbook authors or instructors, you know that changing textbooks is a big deal. You have to redo resources, slides, kind of step back and revamp things in your course. And so it's work. And so you have to look at, is it worth changing? And how can you support instructors in that change? And that was a big thing to me in 2012 when we first started working on this book. I was teaching with another intro text. And, you know, when they came to me to talk to me about writing this intro text, it was like, why would I change? And why would other instructors change? So that has been a big thrust throughout, is providing resources, slides, sample syllabi, everything we can think of to make that ease of transition better and easier for folks. Our target audience, as I mentioned, for the textbook was more non-majors. We've now changed up and added and branched out into mixed majors and even majors courses over the evolution of the text. And how will it be marketed and sold? We'll talk about that a little bit later. But of course, with textbooks, it's different than the trade world. Your reps are your front line in terms of marketing and sales, and certainly the marketing division of your publisher plays a big role, but you can also play a big role in that too. So just a little bit about the difference in academic and trade. And these are not carved in stone. These are a lot my perspective, and there's probably more or some ways that these could possibly be reworded. But when I think of academic publishing, I think of dissemination of knowledge. You're sharing knowledge, evidence-based knowledge. You are putting something out that your colleagues, your peers, and students are going to be using, reading, and applying. So it's more knowledge-based. Whereas in trade, you're kind of doing information, perspectives, opinions, certainly fiction in some arenas, in writing and co-authoring quote diet books back in the 80s and 90s. We didn't have to give references. We didn't send it out for review to our colleagues and have it peer reviewed. So it was quite different than the textbook writing. Certainly with textbooks, you have your editorial teams, you have your artists, you have your editors, you have your marketing folks, you have a huge team. In trade, you have your publisher, yes, and they certainly do their marketing, but you have a different kind of team on your side in trade than you do. It takes a huge village to write a textbook. It takes a small village, in my opinion, to write a trade or popular press type books. With academic, you're attracting scholars. With trade, you're attracting more consumers, public, certain demographics, certainly references and reviews for academic, as I mentioned. You have technology experts. So much of textbooks now also depend on their online platforms and their learning systems, which has become increasingly a big part of our text and probably the driving force for many of the sales now between different books with the digital learning platforms and robust use of graphics and art. Lay books, particularly the ones I wrote and worked with, were mainly just type and press with few pictures, except maybe on the cover or on the back cover. So you didn't have the kind of visuals that you would have in a textbook. So it was different. With trade too, you're sold differently than you are certainly in academic press. I learned this with a book that I wrote in the mid-90s called The Last 5 Pounds, How to Lose Them and Leave Them Forever. I'm trying to remember the exact title. I wouldn't recommend that book anymore. Not that it's bad, but certainly we've learned a lot since the mid-90s in terms of weight management. And I wasn't advising people to lose 5 and 10 pounds. I was telling them to get real. But anyway, so when that book came out, I had to help make the decision whether we released it trade or mass market. And we went with mass market. And mass market is when you see it in grocery stores, you see it in the airport, you see it at Sam's, at Costco, where there's limited shelf space, but it's pretty mass market. And if you hit in those markets, it can really be big sales because people are going there. They're seeing those books. Trade was that 2 or 3 copies would be in a bookstore and they would restock those as they sold. So people would intentionally have to go to the bookstore. And this is in the 90s before all the online and internet. They would have had to go into a bookstore, look for the book specifically, request it. So we opted for mass market. It didn't go over. And so you lose your shelf space. In the mass market, if it doesn't sell, they're not going to hold that space for you. They're going to have other newer books. So it was not a great decision in that case, but it would be for some books. And some folks also say in terms of trade and technology and digital platforms, they follow textbook and academic. They're not quite as robust or innovative because it's not as much a driver as it is in academic. So those are just some of the things I can think of. So just to share a little bit about my journey, and it feels kind of funny doing this, but this is kind of the perspective I'm coming from. I started writing, consulting, and co-authoring in the mid-'80s to early '90s with a health psychologist. And he had written several very popular multi-million copy selling books that were selling. This was before you could get things online, before you could read them on your phone. So you had more physical books back then. He came out with the rotation diet early on, and then the T factor. I was on his research team as the nutritionist, and I initially began working with him by compiling a fat gram counter for the back of his T factor book. That was a premise of counting fat grams back in the late 80s and 90s. And I wrote about 3,000 food entries with fat grams, calories, sodium, fiber, carbohydrate, just a host of things. And back then, I remember I used Word Perfect, and I would just tab over thousands of foods. And I considered myself a compiler, not an author. And also, I couldn't go online to get the information. So I had to write to food companies. I had to go through the grocery store with a clipboard and write things down from labels. I had to use USDA printed data books to get the information. So it was a lot of work. Well, people started printing the back of the hardcover book to carry around with them so they could count their backgrounds and not have to carry this big book around. And from that, my publisher proposed, and I'll never forget the day, I was sitting in the office, we were on a conference call on speakerphone, and they were proposing spinning off the appendix as its own little pocket-sized background counter. And Dr. Catan, the author at the time, he said, well, Jamie did that, so she should be lead author on that. And I was like, okay. And so we spun it off with just some intro, and it was just a little counter. It sold over 7 million copies. I didn't make $7 million, but it did sell like gangbusters. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for over 3 years, and it did very well at the time. You know, this wouldn't be in this market the same. The publisher loved it so much. It was Norton, W.W. Norton, who's actually more of an academic publisher, but they were doing this. What else can we do? So we did the low-fat supermarket shopper's guide. We did the low-fat fast food guide. And those did very well too. T-Factor's still out there. And I still get royalty checks, maybe $15 now. But it's funny that it's still even out there. We ended up doing 7 editions by adding foods and kind of tweaking things. But that was kind of the entree. From that success, I was approached by Pocketbooks to write The Last 5 Pounds. One of the editors there said there was not anything out there to help people lose just a small amount of weight. After meeting her, I thought, you have no business trying to be on a diet or lose weight. She was a lovely, at the time I thought older, in her 50s, and very healthy. And so they contracted with me to write The Last 5 Pounds. They wanted it so quickly on the market that I worked with a ghostwriter, and I would mail her journal articles where I underlined, made notes. I gave her scenarios. I said, in this chapter, I want to cover this, and I would send her snippets, and then she put it all together into a narrative. So it was a very interesting experience. And then I did some more work with Dr. Catan along the way. From those 2, I, was approached by food companies because just my name was out there. And so I did consulting for several food corporations as their nutrition consultant, their media representative. So it was a lot of fun, and all that spun off of those opportunities in early popular press. In 2012, the acquisition editors for Macmillan Learning, W.H. Freeman actually, which was a subsidiary, asked me for coffee one day. He came to Nashville, and he asked me about if I'd be interested in authoring a nutrition textbook. And we talked a lot about it. I asked him why he came to me, and part of it was my publishing history. Part of it was that I had been teaching at that point for almost 15 years, intro nutrition. And he said part of it was that I had really good ratings on Rate My Professor. And at that time, I didn't even know about Rate My Professor. So that was kind of an interesting combination of reasons that he gave. So I agreed. Little did I know what I was really agreeing to, because writing a textbook is a huge amount of work. But I have no regrets in doing that. After about 6 to 9 months of trying to do it solo, I ended up working with and requesting a co-author to help with the infographics, to help with the science. And so I'm a nutritionist. Dr. Nazilski is a nutrition biochemist, and together we really make a good team. And he really took some of the workload off in the Envision. And just as I'm thinking about this, let me share one thing. Because I've been teaching intro nutrition with another textbook for so long, and I tried to write my own. Sometimes you just get things in your head that you've seen, representations of pathways or how things are illustrated, how things are organized in a textbook. So when I put together my textbook and the outline and what would be included, I purposely stopped looking at any introductory level nutrition textbook because I didn't want those images in my head. I didn't want to feel like it had to be like a textbook that's out there. Once I had compiled everything, I did then look to make sure that I was addressing topics that were being covered in my competitors or not including too much that weren't being included in introductory level textbooks. So if you're going to add to a market that's already out there, not a unique new text, you do have to think about a lot of things. And as I mentioned before, how's it unique? How's it different? We started in the market at the bottom of the pit, the low level in terms of our competitors. We moved up to number 5. We're now at number 3 in the market. So we're in about 150 schools. So it's done pretty well. And, professors seem to like it, instructors, because it's a little different. It's a story journalistic approach, which was part of our uniqueness. Rather than a straight dialogue, we weave science into stories. And out of those, as I'll share, so a little bit. So this feels a little bit out of place, but publishing contracts. So when I did the trade books, the fat gram counters and the low fat and the last 5 pounds and other trade type books, I had an agent, Richard Pine with Pine and Associates, now called Inkwell Management, who negotiated my contracts, who read my contracts, who worked in my best interest, who questions parts of the contract, and just, I was kind of on the backside, and I trusted him. They typically, an agent took about 15% of your royalties, but they usually could ask for more money. They were asking for money instead of you having to ask for money. So in many situations, it worked out much better in trade because you did have, their legal team, your agent negotiating for you, protecting you, and trying to get the best possible deal for you, and knowing what they're doing because they've worked with many contracts. When I was approached to write the textbook, and reached out to my agent, they didn't handle textbooks. So he released me from that. He wrote me a letter that released his role or his take on anything because I was one of their clients in terms of any percentage on a textbook. But then I had to do my own contract. So I pored over it. And I did not seek the counsel of a literary agent or an attorney. I would recommend that to read it through, to make sure you're protected, to make sure that, to consider all the questions you need to ask. However, one thing I did different, and this was 2012, was I was doing some reading online at the time about textbook contracts. And at that time, textbook sales were primarily print, not digital in 2012. However, I read a couple of places that because digital sells for less than print, that authors should ask for a higher royalty rate on digital. So I did. And at first they really pushed back. So we ultimately agreed that if sales, and this is in my contract, if sales exceeded 50% of total sales as digital, the royalty rate jumped. And it jumped again, its royalty rate, if digital rates went above 80%. So now we're digital above 90% of sales. So my royalty rate is higher because of that initial clause. My publisher doesn't really like that. And they would have liked to renegotiate a few times, but we have not done that. But, there's just lots of little things to consider. And, you do get more sales sometimes with the digital, so it can all even out. But I'm not an expert in terms of contracts, but, really look at it. In our contract, we were able to remove where we had to write the index, because that was in there, that the publisher incurred the cost of writing the index. Some contracts, the author pays either to have the index done or they do it themselves. And that's a big job. Also, about your other editions and, what your role is in those, how your royalties are paid. So there's a lot of aspects, of course, to a contract. And I would recommend too, this is what's one of the many nice things about TAA are the number of resources aimed at supporting authors. This is one on a guide to textbook publishing. Not only are there webinars, books, things you can read, blogs, but at the conferences, these are frequently topics. And so I would highly recommend using these resources. And some of the professionals too that work in the contract area. So as a spinoff, so the day that I went to sign my textbook contract in New York, I was flying back to Nashville. It was on a Friday in 2012. And as I landed and turned my phone back on, I had an invitation from the provost and the dean at my school asking if I would teach one of the inaugural massive open online courses for Vanderbilt on the Coursera platform. I didn't know what a MOOC was. I had no idea, but I couldn't very well turn them down. So I was at the same time producing a MOOC and writing a textbook and teaching. So it was a very intense period of time, but they all kind of were reciprocal. The MOOC actually helped get my name out too for my textbook. My textbook gave me credibility. So, it all kind of overlapped. And this was quite the experience over 3 iterations for this nutrition, health, and lifestyle course offered on Coursera between 2013 and 14. We had 175,000 people register. It was offered for free at the time, unless you wanted the certificate, and then there was a nominal fee. We filmed close to 90 little short videos, and a lot of this came and supplemented writing my textbook because I had to chunk content, and it really helped me in chunking content when I was thinking of sections for the textbook. So it was all kind of aligned at the time. I also, because of the textbook and other things, I was reached out in 2019 to produce a audio course for Learn 25. So it has 16 25-minute, approximately, podcast type sessions on nutrition. And again, it aligns a lot with my text but it's intended more for the NPR or public listener. And it's out there on audiobooks. So all these kind of things can kind of happen simultaneously and build upon another, and and also support one another in terms of not only content, but also marketing and sales, because these kind of things help market and sell the textbook as well. So we are now in our 2.5, I call it, edition. We came out with our second edition in 2019, I think, or 18. First edition came out in 2015. It took almost 3 years to really put it all together, work together, put out that first edition. The first edition won an award with my publisher for STEM Product of the Year, which is rare for a first edition. Nutrition is kind of an interesting sales in marketing it, because it doesn't always have a home at every university in a quote nutrition department. It could be in biology, it could be in ag, it could be, in nursing, it could be all over. So reps sometimes have a hard time finding where the nutrition people are, but it went over well. Our second edition came out, and we just did a digital update that wasn't as extensive a brand new edition, but it's an updated edition. So we don't call it 3. Apparently, and I don't see this in stone, but to put out a new edition, you need at least 30% new content. That's what I've been told by publishers. That's what you read sometimes, because you want to make a substantial enough change and update to warrant a new edition. And just keep thinking. For me, I keep running files of new research, new articles, new ideas for our third edition for when it comes. And that's just the catalog page for my textbook. So just a little bit about the second edition.
Just a moment.
Yes.
I think we lost your slides. So I'm seeing them, but I just heard that the slides are not showing up for everyone else. I wasn't aware of it because I'm seeing them. Can we see if we can get those back up? Okay, so some is saying they're seeing the slides. So some are seeing the slides and some aren't. Okay, that's odd.
All right, I see my slides.
If anybody cannot see the slides, can you tell me that? Because
let's see, it's showing up. Yeah. I mean, mine is.
Maybe it's just for that one person then. Okay. I'm seeing them. So if you're not seeing the slides, we are recording this, and we will, release the recording after the session. So I'm sorry to break in. I know she's going to start showing some visuals that you might really want to be able to see. So I wanted to make sure that everyone could see them. Okay, go ahead, Jamie. I'm hearing pretty much from the people, everyone saying that they can see them. So.
Oh, good. Okay. Thank you. Just a little bit more on second editions or third editions or new editions in general. Macmillan, and I'm sure most all publishers, because some of you are probably published now and working with different publishers. My publisher is very good about doing market surveys with our market, with nutrition instructors, with folks that use the text, for folks that don't use the text. And we incorporate and think about feedback for new editions. So we keep that, even when we're going through the review process in terms of, why don't you put this in there? Or why is this in there? We kind of make note of those things as we think about a new edition. So feedback from your market is really important. One feedback that was kind of challenging to deal with from the market was quite a few instructors wanted a 14-chapter book for nutrition. It's taught in one semester. They basically wanted one chapter per week. Our first edition had 21 chapters. And with our approach as a story-based journalistic textbook, we didn't want our chapters to be overly long and for our market. So condensing 21 chapters into 14 would require combining topics, switching up our stories, just a whole different focus. So we came up with the idea of 14 core chapters to keep our market happy, but then to take the other chapters and make them what we call spotlights. So that was a significant change for second edition, was a revamping of our table of contents. So you can see here in green, the spotlights follow kind of chapters that they might relate to. We also found out which chapters not all instructors taught. A lot of instructors don't teach the life cycle courses chapters. We found out what they wanted more global nutrition and more sustainability content in the second edition. And so, we made 14 chapters and the spotlights that go with them. And so we actually ended up with 22 chapters instead of 21. And the spotlights really are chapters. They just are designed differently in the TOC. And even in the book itself has different colors for those chapters. The pages are kind of a ivory yellow hue instead of white. So you can even distinguish between them that way. We included other components, new pedagogy, and certainly the digital formats and the digital resources were beefed up for the second edition. So I guess my main point is when I remember getting my first copy of the first edition, and I felt like I had just delivered a child, that it was, like all this work, all this time. But then you got to bring that child up. It's not done then. And for nutrition, which is such an evolving, changing science, I continually, and my co-author too, we keep up with new studies, new recommendations, new findings that need to be reflected in the next edition. Some textbooks are more, not more stable topics, I'm not sure what word to use, that aren't changing quite as dramatically and quickly. So, different considerations than for new editions. All right, So in terms of promotion and marketing, you are a big part of the team. And I have had 3 different, maybe 4 marketing managers over the course of my textbook. And some I have really loved and have felt very supported by, and felt that they really were innovative and even aggressive in their marketing. Others less so, that you kind of have to push them and request. Ask for updates, ask for sales numbers, ask for things, because in those conversations, you can also have some conversations about what they're doing. I've asked, like, what are your plans? Because they don't tell me, what kind of marketing is happening. And you really have to engage about how can you support, how can you contribute, be proactive and innovative at that. We did early on a lot of focus groups with potential users of our textbook, market surveys, as I mentioned. I request editorial calls with my editor and my marketing director and my co-author. We meet maybe 4 or 5 times a year just for updates to us and for us to share some thoughts and ideas, and then follow up from those. I make notes, and then I'll say, we discussed this, what's happening, what's the timeline, because sometimes, they've got a lot of books they're working with, and so it serves you well, and it serves your text well to really not only work with your marketing folks, but to also stay engaged and follow up with them, and even push when it's appropriate. Get to know your reps and support them. I've only gotten to go to 2 or 3 national sales meetings, which was a great opportunity to interact and meet sales reps. I try to let them know that I'm available, excuse me, if they need me to, if they need me to reach out to an instructor to answer questions. I've gone on sales calls over the years at different times. A couple of times when I was going to be in certain areas of the country and had a little extra time, I would reach out to reps through my marketing manager in those areas and say, hey, I'll be in town. If there's any calls you'd like me to go on with you too, I'd be happy to. I do informational podcasts for my reps about once every month or so, like a 5-minute podcast, maybe just even on like eating during the holidays or dietary supplements, or about resources from the text. I have a unique resource called Assertion Evidence Slides that I developed for our textbook. And I had reps asking, how are those different? So I did a podcast on evidence, on the assertion evidence slide approach to PowerPoint. Sometimes you could email potential adopters. You need to work with your marketing folks and your reps when you do that. Campus visits, like I mentioned, join those. Promotions and giveaways. We now have this little grocery list that reps can hand to an instructor when they go in. We've done, this was a couple years ago, pre-COVID, when they were actually doing physical visits to campus. This is the 18-month academic calendar that has pictures of our infographics and then a sales. And just something to initiate a conversation and for reps to be able to give something to instructors that they're visiting. COVID changed things a little. But we've gone back to having this physical grocery list now that reps can return to campus. We have, Macmillan has a teaching and learning community, and within that there's a nutrition community, so I post regularly in that for adopters and non-adopters. Anybody can use that with teaching tips and with information. professional association members. I'm a nutritionist, so I attend nutrition-related meetings, and I usually have a business card or a stack of giveaways, and I'm in a group called Nutrition Educators of Health Professionals that is mainly nutrition educators. So I'm able to work with them. And then social media, be a presence. And you don't have to blatantly push your book, but it can also be visualized or kind of incorporated in certain ways. So this is my last real content slide. This is, I got this about a month ago. And again, I had to request it. They will not just automatically send you this. I asked for an adoption report on my textbook because I don't know who's all using it or who has adopted it. So I asked for this. This is current and former adoptions across, by state. And, it was thrilling to see. And I also have used this in the past for my annual evaluations at my university to say, hey, I wrote this textbook and it's out there at all these, different universities, which is a boom for them as well. And that brings back one other comment, and we got a bit of time. When you I would teach courses that sometimes had 200 students, and I would require my own textbook. Some universities require that you pay your royalties from your sales within your institution back to the university, that you can't earn that money yourself by requiring it within the same school. So how to keep track of that is impossible because digital, print, you don't know what they're ordering, what they're doing. Sometimes you can just make a kind of gift that is an estimate of the amount that you might have earned off your own students. Vanderbilt wasn't that strict about this. So what I did was I kind of gave back to my students. I would bring food in at times. I would bring, giveaways for activities. I just did things that, and I also made some contributions to my department as gifts. So it's going to be unique, but it is something you have to check into with your university is what is their policy for publishing authors that receive royalties and how that is reflected when you require your own textbook within your own university. It doesn't apply outside. But so anyway, that was a lot of info, and thank you for indulging me in sharing my own experiences and perspective, and hopefully it gave you a little insight, particularly for those of you in the early stages of textbook writing. But I'd love to chat and answer any questions or address questions. Hopefully I can answer them. But Kim, did we get many questions?
I'm seeing just one so far, but everyone definitely has an opportunity now to put your question into the question box in the control panel. And we'll start out with this question, which is, how does the digital environment change the way textbooks are written and or formatted?
Oh, that's a great question. But I have never thought about it from exactly that perspective. With our textbook now, initially when it came out, it was pretty clunky in terms of how you read it online. It was like PDFs and things. Now it's much more, set up digitally where, you can see the infographics, things you can highlight, you can take notes, you can go to the animations, you can do all kinds of things digitally. In terms of actually writing it, it's a very good question. One thing I think, when you read something digitally, you're reading it on your computer or your phone, I think that it becomes even more important to chunk your content, not to have just continual dialogue, but to think about how you organize your content with headings and subheadings. because it's easier with a print book to kind of make sense of it all. But digitally, at least from my perspective, the chunking of content makes more sense. And then even as you're writing or updating, I've talked to my editor recently about, or they've talked to me about doing a digital forward version of our textbook. And I will tell you, I won't be surprised if for third edition they let us know it's only going to be digital, because sales of print are not making up much of our sales. It is mostly all digital. I much prefer a print book or a loose leaf or something. But I think the way the market is moving just over these 10 years, where it's dramatically changed from primarily print sales to primarily digital sales, and a lot based on cost, a lot based on accessibility. I've been disappointed with my textbook, but I found something out just a week or two ago that kind of appeased me, but that with nutrition and a lot of pre-health professionals, I liked the fact that I felt like they could keep their nutrition book and use it as a resource in future courses or even in practice, because a lot of these future health professionals maybe take one nutrition course and then they're out there giving recommendations or being asked questions. So I love the thought that they had some sort of resource available to them, whereas digital goes away after a semester, and so they can't use that. Although I found out they can actually download, which I never knew, and have access for 4 years to the ebook, which that option, so I didn't even realize that, which is now a real bonus, I think, that there is a way they can actually keep the text. Now, whether they'll go back and look at the download as much as they would actually look over and see it on their shelf and pull it off, might be a little different. But that's a really good question. And, the extent of the digital offerings is amazing. And what they can do visually is amazing too.
Okay. So there are more questions. So this person is asking about sunsetting agreements with co-authors, and she's elaborated a bit by asking because I wrote 3 editions of a textbook and workbook reader combo, and then invited a co-author to join me for a 4th edition with the intent of turning the rating over to the co-author for the next few editions. But we never created a formal sunsetting agreement, and I wonder if we should.
I don't know a lot about sunsetting, but I would definitely say a formal agreement with a co-author. I know from discussions with my textbook author about the future, because if the textbook is doing well, I'm 65, my co-author is 68. So, we've got another edition or 2 with us. But if the textbook is still continuing to sell and doing well, there may come a time where we're going to want to step back for one reason or another. So our current game plan is, when 3E comes around, is that we are going to contract with a couple of prospective third authors, and get a sense of their work, get a sense of how we work together, get a sense of just how they do before we formally add them as a third author. Now, my book in bookstores, in sales, on the royalty reports, is not by its title, it's by Pope. It's by my last name. So they want to keep that on there, and probably my co-author's name as well, even when a third author may step in. So that's kind of our game plan, and I'm sure when we'll have a contract in terms of them contracting to help with certain content and chapters, maybe give them several solo to work on while we work on others, with that in mind of, rolling out in the future to another author. And of course, that will change the royalty rate. I think as you step away, that percentage goes down in terms of what you take. Now, I was at the conference in October for the Nutrition and Dietetics Conference, and the #1 textbook in the author in the market in nutrition. I really like this author, and I was talking to her. she told me that her publisher actually bought out her contract. And so she's not going to have anything. They paid her, they offered her something to buy out her contract, but her name will remain with the textbook. But then they will actually be handling it. But because her name is part of how that textbook is recognized, sold, and purchased, they're keeping her name. But I guess the offer was attractive enough that they bought out her contract. So it's interesting. But I would always say, when in doubt, get it in writing, get an agreement, and see, what else is being done. I bet that's addressed in some of the TAA publications about different approaches to kind of phasing out of a project and bringing in other authors. I hope that helped.
Yeah, thank you. So we have someone's asking about how you deal with writer's block.
Writer's block?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm a person that works great with deadlines. And my publisher gives a production schedule of when things are due. And so I don't have time to really have writer's block when we're in the midst of that production schedule. And because I have a co-author, we, like a chapter is due, say, on this date with, the revisions and the draft and all those things. When we submit that, it has to have both our input. So I usually take first pass, go through existing content, make changes, updates, recommendations, send it to him. He does the same, comes back to me. If I have questions, it goes back and forth. So we have to kind of work in advance, even at those deadlines. And then we submit it, to our production manager, our editor, for that part. So in the midst of it, I just keep rolling because I don't have time to really stop, because things are on such a tight schedule based on when it has to go, when they call it put it to bed. When it goes to bed, then everything has to be done, because then you can't touch it anymore. So dependent on that, the production schedule is established. And, one of our pushes right now is to say, when are you thinking of 3E? Because we need to plan our lives around it. I don't want to pick up a new class or a new project if I have third edition coming up. So you have to think about that aspect too. But writer's block, I think just doing something. For nutrition, I follow a lot of nutrition news websites, a lot of things. I give talks, which helps keep me updated. And I just keep running files of by chapter and by spotlight and add to it, with whether it's a media story that'll cue me to remember about something new, journal articles, so that when we come to 3E, I've already got a file with things that I need to consider, and I'm not starting from scratch then. So I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, I know that TAA even has articles on dealing, and they have a writer's workshop to help people, engage, stay on track, put some time in each day. And I also keep a little stick-em notes, and I put them in my textbook when I think of things that I think, and I go ahead and stick them in for next editions or updates. We can periodically do updates even within an edition. If things are, if wording needs to be changed for one reason or another, that can happen.
Thanks, Jamie. So I think Jamie was referring to our Month of Motivation program. And anyone that wants, to learn more about that or has any questions about it can reach out to me directly at kim.pawlak, PAWLAK, at taaonline.net. Now I'll put that in the chat as well. I think we have time for one more question, and that is, how does creativity come into play when it comes to textbook writing?
Oh, wow. I think creativity comes into play under the domain of, for textbooks in particular, of how is your book unique and different from maybe other common books, and how can you put a spin, an approach that's a little different than others. Ours, I really appreciate that we're co-published with Scientific Americans, because we definitely have that story journalistic approach where science is weaved into a story that gives us a little more elbow room for creativity and, thinking about context of the information. I'm thinking too, that early slide about what is this book and how is it different? When Pocketbook approached me about writing The Last 5 Pounds in the 90s, at first she called it The Last 10 Pounds, but that had already been written. And so they changed it to The Last 5 Pounds. So when you consider a book, see what's out there. It doesn't mean you have to dig deep into each of those books, but see what's out there and then get creative on how can I do something a little different. And, if the market's pretty saturated, it makes it more of a challenge, particularly for the intro level books. There's going to be more for some of these big courses that are already out there and established and being utilized. So yours has to be creatively different enough to get the attention of instructors and to warrant making that kind of change. For more niche books, so to speak, that are a little different, that may not be as big an issue. And, also get creative about your organization of your text. Make it a little different than other books. I think our spotlight is unique for our textbook. And certainly your illustrations and your infographics are a place for creativity. I love the work my co-author does. He is the main visionary for our infographics. He designs it, drafts it, draws it, and it goes to an artist for rendering, goes back to him and me to look at, and we have input, but our visuals are amazing, and they really are a combination of science and creativity.
Okay. Well, before we close out the webinar today, I also wanted to invite you all. It's open to members and non-members for the month of November, is to our TA Conversation Circle. And it is live, open discussion with a group of whoever joins us. And we are going to talk about dealing with burnout, which I can imagine is a topic that maybe is everyone here is dealing with at some point. So I'm going to put a link in the chat to the page where you can sign up for the Conversation Circle for November, and it is going to be held on November 30th. So hopefully you will be able to.
Sounds great.
Yeah. So
and Kim, I just want to put in a plug for TAA. I was telling Kim before the webinar started that, I'm in other nutrition related associations and such. But when I joined TAA about 3 or 4 years ago, it felt like, oh, these are my people. That regardless of discipline, other authors just understand. And, it really is almost independent of discipline. When you talk about contracts and approaches and, some of the way the publishing industry is changing is pretty dramatic. And TAA has helped keep up with that and advise authors and make them aware of what they need to be aware of changes in the industry and how that might impact, their books, their book sales, and their royalties and their future as an author. So.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. And thank you all for participating in today's presentation.